2:09 a.m. The Barents Sea, 73 degrees north latitude, 31 degrees east longitude, at 280 meters depth, in water that registered 4 degrees Celsius against the submarine's hull sensors. The Yasin M-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine had been holding its patrol position for 14 days. Above it, the Arctic winter had produced a storm system with surface winds of 47 knots and wave heights exceeding 8 meters. The surface conditions were irrelevant to the submarine. They were highly relevant to the P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft that would normally be providing continuous anti-submarine coverage of the Barents Sea approach corridor. The P-8 had diverted to its alternate operating altitude ceiling at 2:41 a.m. the previous day, and had been flying abbreviated search patterns since. Its acoustic buoy deployment accuracy degraded by the wind conditions. Its sensor dwell time on each search grid reduced by the fuel consumption of flying in sustained turbulence. The Russian Northern Fleet's Operational Planning Cell had been tracking North Atlantic storm system forecasts for 11 weeks. The current storm window had been identified as the optimal launch environment 9 days before the submarine departed its base at Gadzhievo. At 2:09 a.m., the submarine's commanding officer received his firing authorization. The Yasin M carries 32 Kalibr cruise missiles in vertical launch cells forward of the conning tower. The Kalibr III M14 land attack variant has a range exceeding 2,500 kilometers. A terrain-following flight profile at altitudes between 50 and 150 meters, and a terminal accuracy within 3 meters of its designated aim point. It is, by any technical measure, the most capable conventionally armed cruise missile in the Russian inventory. It had been used operationally in Syria and Ukraine. Its performance characteristics were not theoretical. They were documented across hundreds of observed combat firings. The first Kalibr left its launch cell at 2:09 a.m. The second followed 4 seconds later. The submarine's launch sequence cycled through all 32 cells in under 3 minutes. 200 meters to the northwest, a second Yasin M began its own sequence at 2:11 a.m. 3 Oscar II-class submarines, older hulls, but each carrying 24 P-800 Oniks supersonic anti-ship missiles and 12 additional Kalibr cells, were positioned in a spread formation across a 180-kilometer arc of the Barents Sea. Their launch windows were staggered at 4-minute intervals, a sequencing designed to present the defensive network with a continuing stream of inbound detections, rather than a single large event that would allow the system to calculate total package volume and pre-allocate interceptor resources. By 2:31 a.m., the Northern Fleet's submarine force had placed 156 weapons in flight. The package was organized across 2 target categories. The primary category, NATO's northern military infrastructure in Norway, specifically Evans Air Station, the P-8 Poseidon forward operating base that provided anti-submarine coverage of the GIUK Gap and the Norwegian Sea approaches. Ramsund Naval Station, housing the Norwegian Coastal Defense Fleet and NATO's Northern Maritime Coordination Node. Bardufoss Air Base, the Norwegian Air Force's primary northern combat aviation facility. The Globus III radar installation on Andøya Island, a space surveillance and missile defense tracking radar whose intelligence value to NATO in any conflict scenario made it a first strike priority under Russian operational doctrine. And the undersea fiber optic relay station at Andøya, the communications infrastructure that connected NATO's northern sensor network to the alliance's command architecture. The secondary category, the USS Harry S, Truman Carrier Strike Group, operating approximately 380 kilometers southwest of Jan Mayen Island in the Norwegian Sea. The Truman Group had been in the Norwegian Sea for 11 days, its presence a deliberate signal of alliance commitment during a period of elevated tension that had begun with a Russian military exercise near the Finnish border that had not concluded on its declared schedule. The P-800 Oniks supersonic anti-ship missiles from the Oscar II submarines were assigned to the carrier group. Their Mach 2.5 terminal speed created an intercept geometry that demanded response times measured in seconds rather than minutes. The strategic logic behind the combined package was not primarily military. It was temporal and political. The Russian operational assessment had been built around the specific characteristics of the Article 5 consultative process. A confirmed Russian military action against NATO territory would trigger an Article 5 consultation among 32 member states. The consultation process, under the most optimistic political conditions, required a minimum of 4 hours to reach an operational authorization level that would permit a coordinated alliance military response. The Russian planning cell had modeled this timeline against the estimated flight time of the Kalibr package to its Norwegian targets, approximately 90 minutes. The gap between first weapon impact in Norway and NATO's authorization for a coordinated response was assessed at a minimum of 2.5 hours. In those 2.5 hours, the Russian calculation assumed that the physical facts established by the initial strike would be irreversible. Ivanez would be non-operational. Ramsund would be degraded. The Globus III radar, the most politically sensitive target in the package, because its destruction would degrade U.S. missile defense monitoring capability globally, would no longer exist as a functioning system. The carrier group would be under active engagement pressure that would consume its defensive resources and prevent it from generating offensive sorties toward Russian territory. The flaw in the assessment was not in the political timeline. The political timeline was accurately modeled. The flaw was in the assumption that the defensive network's activation also required political authorization. It did not. The intercept systems did not need a consultation process. They needed a launch detection and a firing solution. Both were available before the Kalibr package had climbed to cruise altitude. 2:09 a.m. Ramstein Air Base, Germany. U.S. European Command Air Operations Center. The space-based infrared system satellite, covering the North Atlantic and Arctic sectors, had detected the first launch thermal signature at 2:09 a.m. The Kalibr's solid fuel booster, generating a distinctive combustion profile that the SBIRS processing algorithms had been calibrated against since 2017. The launch notification reached the Ramstein Air Operations Center in 3.1 seconds. By 2:11 a.m., with the second submarine's launch sequence confirmed and the Oscar II signatures appearing on the correlation feed, the duty watch officer had initiated the Combined Air Operations Center alert sequence that activated every interceptor-capable asset in the European theater's defensive architecture. She had been in this watch position for 6 months. She had processed 14 routine alert activations during that period: aircraft intercepts, unidentified radar contacts, spoofing attempts. At 2:11 a.m., with the correlation feed showing 47 confirmed launch signatures in a 2-minute window and additional detections still resolving, she processed the information in the way her training had prepared her to process it and initiated every activation simultaneously rather than sequentially. The system was designed for sequential activation as a standard operational protocol. She judged that sequential was not appropriate for what her screen was showing. Her supervisor reviewed and confirmed the simultaneous activation 14 seconds after she initiated it. The Norwegian Air Force's F-35A squadrons at Ørland and Evans, the very base targeted by the Kalibr package, received the alert at 2:13 a.m. The aircraft on ground alert were airborne within 7 minutes. The P-8 operating in its degraded storm pattern northeast of the Norwegian coast received a priority retasking order that vectored it toward the submarine detection corridor despite the weather conditions. The operational imperative outweighed the endurance cost. On the Norwegian Sea, the Truman strike group had been at heightened alert status for 9 days. The group's 4 Aegis escorts had been maintaining active radar search posture on a rotating basis since the elevated tension assessment had been issued. At 2:11 a.m., all 4 transitioned to full active simultaneous radar search. The power demand this imposed on the ship's electrical systems was significant and was normally avoided for that reason. At 2:11 a.m., power management was not the priority. The Truman Group had a geometry problem that was different from anything the carrier groups in the Pacific and Persian Gulf scenarios had faced. The Norwegian Sea in February, in a storm producing 8-meter swells, is not an environment where radar detection ranges are uniform and intercept geometry is clean. Wave clutter at low radar elevation angles reduced the effective detection range for low-altitude cruise missiles to approximately 60% of the nominal figure. The Kalibr flying at 50 meters altitude was harder to detect at long range in these sea state conditions than it would have been in the Persian Gulf. The storm that had been selected as the optimal launch environment was also degrading the defensive radar picture. The E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft, operating above the storm layer at altitude, was the network's compensating sensor. Flying at 25,000 feet above the clutter environment, the E-2D's radar could look down at low-altitude cruise missiles against a clean background rather than against a sea surface return. Its detection ranges against the Kalibr package were not degraded by the storm. By 2:18 a.m., the E-2D had correlated 89 individual Kalibr tracks routing toward Norway and 31 P-800 Oniks tracks routing toward the carrier group's position. The Aegis network began generating SM-6 firing solutions against the P-800 Oniks at 2:19 a.m. The P-800's Mach 2.5 terminal sprint was the defensive network's first priority because its closing time from the outer detection range to the ship was shorter than the Kalibrs. A Mach 2.5 missile at 150 kilometers range has a time to impact of approximately 3.5 minutes. The SM-6's effective range against a supersonic sea-skimming target in degraded sea state conditions was the variable that the fire control system's engagement solution was solving in real time. Of 31 P-800 Oniks in flight against the carrier group, 24 were engaged and neutralized by SM-6 between 2:22 a.m. and 2:29 a.m. at ranges between 55 and 140 kilometers. 7 entered the inner defense perimeter. By minute 22 of the engagement, the United States had expended $1.6 billion in interceptors and precision munitions across the theater. The North Atlantic Weather System had added a cost multiplier that no planning document had quantified, but every crew member was experiencing directly. Flight deck operations in 8-meter swells require extraordinary physical effort from every person working topside. 2 flight deck crew members had been moved to the medical station by 2:31 a.m. from sea state-related injuries sustained during the surge operations that were generating the defensive sorties. They were replaced immediately by backup personnel. The flight deck did not stop. Of the 7 P-800 Oniks that entered the inner defense perimeter, 5 were engaged by ESSM and CRAM. 2 closed to CIWS range. 1 was neutralized by CIWS at 600 meters. The second impacted USS Normandy on the group's western perimeter, a 300-kilogram warhead detonating against her forward superstructure, disabling her forward radar array and the forward section of her VLS. Her after VLS and propulsion were unaffected. She remained underway at combat-capable status. 1 destroyer hit. 30 of 31 Oniks intercepted. The Kalibr packages targeting Norway were the more complex problem. Not because the intercept geometry was harder, it was not, but because the Norwegian defensive architecture was not positioned to generate the same intercept volume against 89 cruise missiles that 2 Aegis carrier groups could generate against a comparable package in warmer water. Norway's ground-based NASAMS air defense batteries and the SAMP/T systems positioned in the northern region had the technical capability to engage the Kalibr package. They were operating in the same storm environment as everything else in the theater. Their radar detection ranges against low-altitude cruise missiles in the February North Sea weather were degraded by the same factors. The F-35A sorties from Erland and the remaining aircraft from Evans, airborne before the Kalibrs reached Norwegian airspace, were the primary intercept layer. between 2:26 a.m. and 2:44 a.m., Norwegian and USF 35A aircraft operating under E-2D and E-3 sentry sensor queuing engaged the Kalibr package in a running intercept campaign across the Norwegian Sea and the Norwegian coast approaches. The F-35A's AESA radar operating against a cruise missile in open air without sea clutter interference produced detection and firing geometry that matched the aircraft's designed employment envelope. 51 Kalibrs were intercepted by F-35, AAIM-120D, and AIM-9X engagements during the ingress phase. NASAMS batteries covering Evans, Bardufoss, and Ramsund engaged the remainder at terminal phase. 12 additional Kalibrs were intercepted by NASAMS between 2:44 a.m. and 2:51 a.m. 26 Kalibrs reached their aim point zones across the 5 Norwegian targets. Evins received 7 impacts across its runway complex and fuel infrastructure. The runway sustained 3 direct hits, non-operational for an estimated 6 hours, with repair teams pre-positioned under the elevated alert protocol. The fuel farm received 2 impacts, with 2 storage tanks rendered non-functional. Events was degraded. It was not eliminated. The F-35, as that had launched from it before, the impacts were still airborne and still generating sorties. Ramsund received 4 impacts across its pier and maintenance facilities. The primary pier sustained structural damage. 2 vessels berthed at the secondary pier had been moved to standoff anchorage positions 36 hours earlier under the alert protocol. The coordination node's communications infrastructure, housed in a hardened underground facility, was unaffected. Bardufoss received 3 impacts on its runway and aircraft shelter area. 2 aircraft on the ground were rendered non-operational. The runway was assessed as repairable within 4 hours. The Globus III radar installation on Andøya received 5 impacts. The antenna structure sustained significant damage. The processing facility adjacent to the antenna was also impacted. Initial assessment: the radar was non-operational. The full extent of the damage would require 48 hours to assess. This was the single most significant achievement of the Russian strike package, the one target where the intended effect had been achieved at a level that would require weeks, not hours, to restore. The Andøya undersea communications relay received 2 impacts on its surface access facility. The subsurface cable infrastructure was assessed as intact. Service was degraded, but not severed. At 2:47 a.m., the Russian reserve activated. The reserve was not a weapons package. It was an information operation that had been running since 2:09 a.m. in parallel with the physical strike. At 2:47 a.m., coordinated electronic warfare systems aboard 2 Russian intelligence vessels operating in international waters north of the GIUK Gap began transmitting on frequencies that corresponded to NATO command and control communication bands, not jamming, which would have been immediately identifiable, but spoofed traffic, false authentication headers, injected course change orders attributed to NATO command authority, and position spoofing signals aimed at the GPS reference receivers on 2 NASAMS batteries. The spoofing attempt was identified by the NATO Signals Intelligence Cell at Ramsund at 2:51 a.m. The affected NASAMS batteries switched to inertial navigation backup mode within 90 seconds of the identification. The 90-second window had allowed 3 additional Kalibrs to pass through the affected battery's degraded coverage zone without generating valid intercept solutions. 2 impacted in the open ground area southeast of Bardufoss. 1 impacted the Bardufoss communications tower. The Electronic Warfare Reserve had achieved a 90-second gap in coverage at the cost of its own identification and neutralization. The NATO Electronic Countermeasures response to the spoofing frequencies had located the 2 intelligence vessels to within 400 meters. That location data would not be actionable within the current engagement's political authorization parameters. It would be retained. The counter-operation against the submarine force had been running since 2:14 a.m. 5 minutes after first launch detection, when the P-8 had received its priority retasking order despite the storm conditions. Operating in sustained turbulence at reduced altitude, the P-8 crew had been asked to do exactly what their aircraft was not optimized to do: conduct active acoustic search in sea states that degraded buoy accuracy and in winds that affected buoy drop precision. They did it anyway. The first confirmed submarine contact, a Yasen-M acoustic signature correlating to one of the two pre-identified boats, was established at 2:31 a.m. The contact was 22 minutes after first launch, which meant the submarine had completed its firing sequence and was maneuvering to evade. The P-8 dropped its Mark 54 at 2:33 a.m. The torpedo acquired its target at 2:35 a.m. A second P-8 diverted from a southern patrol sector reached the Barents Sea approach at 2:44 a.m. and established contact on a second submarine, one of the Oscar II class, its acoustic signature heavier and more distinct than the Yasen-M's, maneuvering at depth following its own completed launch sequence. The second Mark 54 was deployed at 2:47 a.m. The contact was held until 2:49 a.m., at which point the torpedo's own seeker acquired, and the P-8 crew cleared the engagement zone. The remaining three submarines, two Oscar IIs and the second Yasen-M, were being actively tracked by a combination of the barrier P-8 sorties, a Royal Norwegian Navy submarine operating in the Barents Sea approach corridor that had been maintaining passive contact on one Oscar II since the previous day, and a U.S. Virginia-class SSN that had been assigned to the carrier group's screening element and had been repositioned to a barrier patrol posture 11 days earlier. The Virginia-class contact on the second Yasen-M was the cleanest of the three remaining tracks, a direct passive acquisition at 14 kilometers range that produced a firing solution with 93% confidence at 2:52 a.m. The Virginia-class fired its Mark 48 AD cap at 2:52 a.m. 3 of 5 submarines engaged. 2 remaining Oscar IIs in active tracking by the Norwegian submarine, and the second P-8, both in pursuit contact. Their magazines were empty. They had completed their firing sequences before being located. Their operational contribution to the strike had been fully delivered. Their current tactical situation was one in which they possessed no remaining offensive capability and were being actively pursued by weapon systems designed for exactly this scenario. They were maneuvering toward deeper water and the protection of the ice edge. That was the only option available to them. Operation Northern Edge had been pre-authorized and was executing from 2:19 a.m. The counterstrike against the submarine base infrastructure at Gadzhievo and the Northern Fleet surface support facilities at Severomorsk required a political authorization level that the current rules of engagement did not cover for strikes on Russian territorial soil. Those targets were held. What Northern Edge covered was the 2 intelligence vessels, located to within 400 meters by the signals intelligence exploitation of the spoofing response, and the P-800 Oniks launch infrastructure aboard the Oscar II-class submarines themselves, which were not on Russian soil and were actively being engaged by the anti-submarine campaign. The intelligence vessel question was referred up the authorization chain at 2:54 a.m. It was still pending at the time the initial counterstrike sequence completed. At 3:11 a.m., the last confirmed active Kalibr track in Norwegian airspace was intercepted by a NASAMS battery that had been repositioned during the engagement to cover a gap in the original battery layout. The repositioning had been authorized and executed in 18 minutes, a pre-planned contingency response to exactly the coverage gap the Russian electronic warfare operation had temporarily exploited. 3:17 a.m. Evenes Air Station, runway repair crew staging area. The repair crew chief had been watching the impacts on the runway through the hardened shelter's small observation window since 2:51 a.m. She had pre-positioned her equipment and her team of 11 during the alert period. The moment the all-clear for the immediate Kalibr threat was transmitted to the base at 3:03 a.m., she had her vehicles moving toward the primary impact zone before the transmission had finished. She had 3 craters to fill before the runway could be assessed as operationally usable. Her pre-positioned composite fill material was calculated for 4 craters. She had 1 unit in reserve. At 3:17 a.m., she transmitted her initial damage assessment to the Base Operations Center. 2 craters fillable within standard rapid repair parameters. 1 crater requiring extended repair protocol due to subsurface drainage disruption. Runway partially operational in 4 hours, fully operational in 8. Her estimate was logged at 3:17 a.m. She was already at the first crater. Time from first Kalibr launch detection to completion of all active threat intercepts over Norwegian territory, 62 minutes. Time from first launch to confirmed submarine engagement, 26 minutes. Russian weapons launched: 32 Kalibr from Yasin M primary, 32 Kalibr from Yasin M secondary, 24 Kalibr combined from Oscar 2 batteries, 36 P-800 Oniks from Oscar 2 anti-ship cells. Total, 124 weapons. Additional 32 Kalibr from 2 Oscar 2 boats whose launches were confirmed after initial count. Revised total, 156 weapons. Of 120 Kalibrs tracked against Norwegian targets, 51 intercepted by F-35A sorties, 12 intercepted by NASAMS terminal defense. 57 reached Norwegian territory. Of those 57, 31 were engaged and neutralized by NASAMS terminal phase intercepts. 26 impacted across 5 target zones. Overall Kalibr intercept rate, 78.3%. Of 36, P-800 Oniks against carrier group, 30 intercepted by SM-6 and ESSM, 5 neutralized by CRAM and CIWS, 1 impacted USS Normandy. Oniks intercept rate, 97.2%. Physical effects: Evans, runway degraded, estimated 4-hour partial restoration. Ramsund, pier damage, operational continuity maintained. Bardufoss, runway degraded, 2 aircraft non-operational on ground. Globus III, non-operational, restoration timeline weeks. Andøya relay, surface facility damaged, cable infrastructure intact. USS Normandy, forward superstructure impact, forward VLS disabled, underway combat capable. No U.S. or Norwegian personnel fatalities from direct weapons impacts on military facilities. Counter-ASW results: 3 of 5 submarines engaged, 2 Yasin M and 1 Oscar II assessed as rendered inoperable. 2 Oscar II in active pursuit contact. Magazines exhausted. Total munitions cost including interceptors and ASW weapons, approximately $2.1 billion. Counter-operation costs pending authorization decisions. The Russian operational assessment had correctly identified the storm window, correctly modeled the P-8 detection degradation, correctly calculated the Article 5 political timeline, and correctly identified the Globus III radar as the highest value target in the Norwegian network. Its physical effect at Globus III was the one element of the strike that had achieved its intended outcome without reversal within the engagement timeline. Everything else had encountered a defensive architecture that did not wait for political authorization to function. The Kalibr package had found a Norwegian air defense system that had pre-positioned its F-35A force, pre-repositioned its NASAMS batteries, and coordinated with the carrier group's E-2D sensor architecture. All before the first Russian submarine had surfaced its antenna to receive its firing authorization. The storm had been the optimal launch environment. It had not been the optimal defensive environment. The F-35A did not care about wave height at 25,000 feet. The E-2D's radar performance above the storm layer was the same in February as in July. The storm had degraded the P-8's search efficiency, and the submarines had still been found. 62 minutes. The defensive network had processed 156 weapons, 8-meter swells, GPS spoofing, and a degraded radar environment. Evans would be partially operational in 4 hours. Globus III would not be operational in 4 weeks. The Russian assessment had found one gap in the depth. One target where the depth was insufficient. The margin between what was found and what was not was written in the Globus III damage report and in the repair crew chief's 3:17 a.m. transmission from the Evans runway. Both would be read carefully, in different offices, for different purposes.